So I've been waiting for this because Boris Johnson's big plan, as was many of the Brexiteers' big plans for after Brexit, was to do some spending in the UK. Now, obviously, if you know anything about the Tory party or anything about these people, they really don't want to spend any money in the UK. They'd rather go and spend the UK's money abroad and invest in foreign markets, which is what they were very open about in Brexit. And of course, being in the European Union limited that to some effect. And of course, with the new European tax legislation, which we were going to be part of at that time, that means that they could no longer avoid paying taxes on doing stuff like that. And hence, if you go and look back at the lexicon, all that started back in 2012, soon after that initiative was first used. Why was this used? Because it was seen that after the 2008 financial crash, lots of countries in Europe were losing billions in tax revenue. In fact, you want a good example of this? If we were to close all our tax loopholes, we could have paid for the furlough bill twice over. And of course, today, Boris Johnson comes out and has the audacity to somehow announce his, quote, infrastructure revolution to something equal to FDR's New Deal. It couldn't be further from the truth. And this is something I've been waiting for. So today, this comes from the New Statesman. Why it's absurd for Boris Johnson to compare his spending plans to FDR's New Deal. Boris Johnson is far from the first UK Prime Minister to claim the mantle of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown also paid homage to the Democrat president. And judging by some of the coverage of Johnson's announcement, one might assume such rhetoric is justified. The front page of today's Times hailed a spending spree, that is, as bold as Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. But Johnson's promise of a $5 billion of accelerated capital spending on hospitals, schools, rails and roads, prisons, courts and high streets is less impressive than the government's spin suggests. The total announced by the Prime Minister represents just 0.2% of the UK's 2019 GDP, which comes in at 2.2 trillion. By comparison, FDR's 1933 to 39 economic stimulus, which supported the US economy through the Great Depression, is estimated by economists Price Fishback and Valentina Kalchkovskaya, I think that's how you say it, has said to represent of something about 40% of the US's 1929 pre-depression GDP. As a share of the economy, Johnson's spending plan is 200 times less ambitious than the New Deal. It is also far outweighed by Germany's recent 130 billion stimulus package, which accounts for nearly 4% of the country's GDP. It sounds pretty Rooseveltian, Johnson will declare of his programme in a speech in the West Midlands today. It sounds like a New Deal. All I can say is that it is so far of this is how it is meant to be and to sound, because this is what the times demand. A government that is powerful and determined, that puts its arms around the people at a time of crisis. Yet despite the UK GDP having fallen by 25% since the COVID crisis began, Johnson's announcement includes no new money. The announcement, head summed of 50 billion, has merely been brought forward from the 600 billion previously promised by the Chancellor. And it's a budget due to be spent between now and the middle of 2025. The government's refusal to genuinely elevate Roosevelt's boldness is a complete missed opportunity. Though the UK's national debt now stands at 100.9% of the GDP, the highest level since 1963, borrowing has rarely been cheaper. Indeed, it is such an appetite for UK debt from investors that the government has sold bonds at negative interest rates. Investors are now paying the British state to borrow money from them. Before COVID-19 struck, the government had already committed to borrowing for investment, replicating George Osborne's past pursuit of a budget surplus. But the current plans will do little to compensate for years and even decades of underinvestment. Even after recent increases by the UK government, investment only remains at 0.5%, points below the average economic average of about 3.4% of GDP. Johnson's infrastructure revolution, then, is nothing of the sort. And even if it were, it would not be the sole test of whether the government has abandoned the Hooverite austerity in favour of Rooseveltian stimulus. As well as total investment, the key number to watch is day-to-day spending on public services. Last year, the Institute for Fiscal Studies warned that even by 2023 to 24, current spending on services outside health would be almost 15% lower than at the start of the 2010s. Austerity has inflicted profound damage on the UK's social fabric. Rough sleep in England has increased by 165% since 2010s. Life expectancy has stalled for the first time in more than 100 years. And the number of people in poverty in working families has reached a record high. To truly reverse austerity, the government will need to spend far more on services than that have been neglected for over the last decade. And what have we been telling you since the beginning? This is nothing but a show. It is, as it says clearly there, the money they are spending is nothing. It's not even new money. At a time where we desperately need it. Once again, I guarantee you in that speech, I haven't even seen it yet, but I guarantee you today, Boris Johnson has declared that austerity has ended. Yet you are looking at lots of councils that have almost £6 million in their gaps to try and fill because of the COVID crisis. So that means local councils are going to have to try and cut more budgets, which means more services going, more jobs. You know, austerity hasn't ended despite what Boris Johnson has said today. It's just continuing because the Tories refuse to actually put the money in to spend. In fact, I can't remember who it was now, but someone did a study on what would have happened if instead of going for austerity, we had decided to invest in our country. Our country would have been far better off today than it certainly would have been. And I'll tell you one thing, we probably wouldn't have voted to leave the EU. In fact, I don't even think the referendum would have even been a thing. Because one of the things that was constantly blamed through the past 10 years was the EU for all these problems. And I'm so glad, because now the people who are in charge, who wanted Brexit, they're in charge. They've got no one to blame. They've got not even the EU to blame. Even if Boris Johnson says he's going to walk out and go for a no-deal Brexit, that's not the EU's fault. That's Boris's fault. The EU has said if you want more negotiating time, if you want to extend the transition period, you can. Boris Johnson has said that he is not going to, and that he would rather do a no deal, which will again bring huge damage to this country. And once again, the lies of Brexit just continue and continue to unravel. And not just Brexit, but the Tories in general. I guarantee you, Boris Johnson will say, if not at this week, at some point, austerity is going to end in some way, shape, or form. Or he'll promise that we're not going to resort to austerity. So, what's the best way to do that? Well, we'll look as if we're spending money, but none of that money barely, barely scratches the surface of what this country actually needs after decades of underfunding.